Some things appear only when they're ready to be found. Canyon de Chelly cuts through the high desert of northeastern Arizona like a wound that never fully healed. The Navajo call it Chelly, which translates simply to inside the rock, though the name carries weight far beyond its meaning. For more than 5,000 years, people have lived within these red sandstone walls. Ancestral Puebloans, Hopi ancestors, and the Diné, who still call this land home. The canyon stretches 26 miles through the Navajo Nation, its sheer cliffs rising as high as 1,000 feet in places, its floor dotted with cottonwood trees, and the silent remains of cliff dwellings that seem to grow from the rock itself. White House Ruin is perhaps the most photographed of these ancient sites. It sits tucked into an alcove roughly halfway up the canyon wall, its pale plastered walls giving the structure its English name. Spanish explorers documented it in the 1800s. American surveyors mapped it in 1902. Thousands of tourists descend the 2.5-mile trail each year to stand beneath it, cameras raised, trying to capture something that photographs never quite convey. The ruin has been studied, sketched, and cataloged more thoroughly than almost any other site in the canyon. Every petroglyph, every pictograph, every faded handprint left by ancient inhabitants has been documented in federal archives going back more than a century. Which is why what happened in the summer of 1987 remains so difficult to explain. Dr. Margaret Holloway had worked for the National Park Service for 11 years by the time she arrived at Canyon de Chelly in June of that year. Her specialty was rock art documentation, the painstaking process of photographing, measuring, and cataloging the thousands of images left on stone surfaces throughout the American Southwest. She had spent the previous spring at Mesa Verde and was scheduled to spend 6 weeks at Canyon de Chelly, updating the photographic record of several key sites. The work was routine. Holloway would arrive at each location with her equipment, set up her camera on a tripod, and take dozens of photographs under different lighting conditions. She would then compare her images to those in the existing archives, noting any deterioration, vandalism, or environmental damage. On the morning of June 23, 1987, Holloway descended the White House Trail alone. The temperature was already climbing toward 90 degrees. She reached the ruin by 9:15 and began her documentation of the lower walls, working methodically from left to right. It was shortly after 11 when she noticed it. On a panel approximately 4 feet above the ground, in an area she had photographed dozens of times in previous visits, there was a small painted figure she had never seen before. It depicted a humanoid shape, perhaps 8 inches tall, rendered in faded red and white pigment. The figure appeared to be holding something in its outstretched hand, an object Holloway could not identify. Its head was slightly elongated, and 2 short lines extended from either side, possibly representing ears or some form of headdress. Holloway checked her previous photographs. She checked the 1972 survey. She checked the 1949 documentation and the original 1902 sketches. The wall in every prior record was blank. She photographed the figure from multiple angles, made detailed sketches, and collected a small pigment sample for laboratory analysis. Then she returned to the canyon rim and filed her preliminary report with the regional office in Flagstaff. The first official response came 3 days later. A senior archaeologist named Raymond Sosi, himself a member of the Navajo Nation, drove out from Window Rock to examine the site. Sosi had worked in Canyon de Chelly for nearly 2 decades and knew its rock art better than almost anyone alive. His reaction, according to Holloway's personal notes, was unusual. He didn't say much at first, she wrote. He just stood there looking at it for a long time. Then he asked me if I had shown anyone else. I said no. He nodded and told me that was good. Tsosie reportedly spent 3 hours at the site, taking his own photographs and measurements. When Holloway asked for his assessment, his answer was carefully worded. The style is consistent with ancestral Puebloan work from the late Pueblo III period, he said. The pigment composition matches other pictographs in the canyon. There is no indication of modern forgery or recent application. When Holloway pressed him on how a 700-year-old painting could appear on a wall that had been documented as blank for 85 years, Tsosie did not answer directly. "There are things in this canyon that don't follow the rules we expect," he said. "The elders have stories. I'm not the one to tell them." 2 weeks later, the pigment analysis came back from a laboratory in Tucson. The results confirmed what Tsosie had suggested. The paint was composed of iron oxide and calciumite, calcium, calcium carbide, calcium carbide, calcium it, calcium carbonate. Calcium carbonate, materials consistent with pigments used in the region between 1200 and 1400 CE. Carbon dating of organic binders in the paint placed its creation somewhere between 1310 and 1370. The pictograph, by every scientific measure, was ancient, but it had not been there before. What followed over the next 18 months remains poorly documented, and that perhaps is the point. Holloway's initial report was filed with the Park Service's regional office and forwarded to the National Archives branch responsible for archaeological records. Standard procedure would have required the new pictograph to be added to the official site documentation, cross-referenced with existing surveys, and included in future management plans for White House ruin. None of this happened. In September of 1987, Holloway received a letter from the Southwest Regional Director informing her that her documentation had been received and reviewed, but that no update to existing records is warranted at this time. The letter offered no explanation. When Holloway requested clarification, she was told that the matter had been referred to the Navajo Nation Historic Preservation Department for cultural consultation. She was advised not to discuss her findings publicly until that consultation was complete. The consultation, as far as anyone can determine, never concluded. There is no record of any formal meeting, no written determination, no final report. The file simply went silent. By early 1989, something stranger had occurred. Holloway, preparing a paper for an academic conference, attempted to retrieve her original photographs and field notes from the Park Service archives. She was told that the materials had been misfiled and could not be located. Her pigment sample, sent to the University of Arizona for additional analysis, had been returned to the originating office, but no one at that office could confirm receiving it. When Holloway visited White House ruin again in March of 1989, she brought a photographer from the Navajo Times who had agreed to document the pictograph independently. The figure was still there, faded but visible, exactly where she had first seen it. The photographer took 12 exposures. When the film was developed, every frame showing that section of the wall was overexposed, washed out in a blaze of white light that obscured the stone surface entirely. The photographer could not explain it. His equipment had functioned normally for every other shot that day. Holloway resigned from the Park Service 4 months later. She took a teaching position at Northern Arizona University and never published her findings. In a 1993 interview with a graduate student researching Canyon de Chelly archaeology, she declined to discuss the pictograph in detail. "I documented what I saw," she said. "That's all I can tell you. What happened to that documentation is someone else's question to answer." Raymond Tsosie passed away in 2001. In the years before his death, he reportedly told family members that he had seen things in the canyon that weren't meant for reports, though he never elaborated on what he meant. The pictograph at White House ruin has never been added to any official survey. It does not appear in the Park Service's current documentation of the site. Visitors who ask about it are told that no such image exists. And yet, occasionally, someone descends the trail and sees it, a small figure, faded red and white, holding something unidentifiable in its outstretched hand. They photograph it. They return home and compare their images to those in guidebooks and academic papers. The wall in every published photograph is blank. Some of them write letters. Some of them make phone calls. Most of them eventually stop asking questions. The canyon keeps its own records, and some things, it seems, appear only when they choose to be seen. The river knows something it will not say. Chelly Wash does not behave like other waterways in the American Southwest. For most of the year, it runs dry, a sandy arroyo cutting through the heart of Canyon de Chelly, carrying only the memory of water and the occasional flash flood that roars through after summer storms. But even when the wash is empty, something moves through it. The Navajo, who have lived along its banks for centuries, have a name for it, though most will not speak it to outsiders. They say the wash carries voices the way other rivers carry sediment, slowly, persistently, from somewhere deep in the canyon to somewhere no one has ever found. The canyon itself stretches more than 26 miles through the Defiance Plateau in northeastern Arizona. Its walls rise nearly 1,000 feet in places, layered sandstone the color of dried blood and burnt orange. Cottonwood trees cluster along the wash, their roots drinking from underground springs that feed the soil even when the surface is bone dry. The ancestral Puebloans built their homes in the alcoves here more than 1,000 years ago. The Navajo arrived centuries later and never left. To this day, families still farm the canyon floor, growing corn and peaches in soil their great-great-grandparents tended. It is a place of profound silence. Sound behaves strangely between the high walls. Echoes return at odd intervals, sometimes delayed, sometimes not at all. Park rangers have long noted that visitors often speak in whispers without realizing it, as if the canyon demands a certain reverence. But the silence is not complete, and what breaks it, according to dozens of reports spanning more than 40 years, defies easy explanation. The first documented account came in 1973. A geology student named Patricia Alderman was conducting fieldwork along the Upper Wash near the junction with Canyon del Muerto. She was alone, collecting soil samples in the early afternoon when she heard what she initially took to be another hiker. It was a woman's voice, she wrote in her field journal, humming, 4 notes, repeated over and over. I thought someone was around the bend, maybe washing clothes in the stream, but when I walked toward it, the sound moved. It was always just ahead of me, always upstream. Alderman followed the sound for nearly half a mile before stopping. The moment she stood still, the humming ceased. She waited several minutes in complete silence, then resumed walking. The sound returned immediately, the same 4 notes, the same distance ahead, as if it had been waiting for her. She mentioned the experience to a Navajo guide named Samuel Benally when she returned to the canyon rim that evening. His response unsettled her more than the sound itself. He didn't seem surprised, Alderman wrote. He just nodded and said, "You shouldn't have followed it." When I asked what he meant, he changed the subject to him. He wouldn't talk about it again. Alderman completed her fieldwork and returned to the University of New Mexico. She never published her account, but her journal was donated to the university's archives after her death in 2004. A graduate student rediscovered it 8 years later while researching acoustic anomalies in canyon environments. By then, the file had grown considerably thicker. Between 1973 and 2010, the Park Service received at least 31 informal reports describing the same phenomenon. The details varied slightly. Some witnesses described the humming as melodic, others as monotonous, but the core elements remain consistent. A woman's voice, 4 notes, always upstream, always stopping when the listener stopped. Marcus Tafoya, a seasonal ranger who worked at Canyon de Chelly from 1991 to 1998, recalled discussing the reports with colleagues. "It came up every few months," he said in a 2015 interview. "Someone would come back from the wash looking a little shaken, asking if we knew anything about the humming. We'd tell them it was probably wind through the rocks or maybe someone playing a radio somewhere. But the truth is, we'd heard it too. Most of us had. We just didn't talk about it." Tafoya described his own encounter in the autumn of 1994. He had been hiking alone near Standing Cow Ruin when the sound began, faint at first, then clearer as he moved upstream. "It was definitely a woman's voice," he said, "not singing words, just humming. The same 4 notes over and over. I remember thinking it sounded sad, not frightening, just incredibly sad, like someone mourning something they'd lost a long time ago." He followed the sound for approximately 10 minutes before forcing himself to stop. "I don't know why I stopped," he admitted. "Something just told me not to go any further, and the moment I stood still, it was gone. Complete silence. I waited there for probably 15 minutes, and nothing. The second I started walking again, there it was, ahead of me. Same distance, same 4 notes. Tafoya turned back. He never followed the sound again. Lorraine Whitehorse, a Navajo elder who grew up farming in the canyon, offered a different perspective when interviewed in 2009. "My grandmother used to warn us about the wash," she said. "She said there was a woman down there who lost her children a long time ago. She's still looking for them. If you hear her, you're supposed to be quiet. You're supposed to let her pass. If you follow her, she might think you're one of them." Whitehorse paused before adding, "But she won't find what she's looking for. She never does." In 2011, a team of audio engineers from Arizona State University received permission to conduct a formal study of acoustic phenomena in Canyon de Chelly. The project was led by Dr. Eleanor Vance, a specialist in environmental acoustics who had previously studied sound propagation in slot canyons throughout Utah and Arizona. The team spent 3 weeks in the canyon, placing sensitive recording equipment at intervals along the Chinle Wash. They documented wind patterns, water flow, animal activity, and the natural acoustic properties of the sandstone walls. On the 9th day, one of the recorders captured something unusual. The file, logged at 2:17 in the afternoon on September 14th, contained approximately 4 minutes of ambient canyon sound. Wind, distant bird calls, the rustle of cottonwood leaves, but beneath these sounds, barely audible without amplification, was something else. When the recording was filtered and enhanced, a low-frequency hum emerged. It was rhythmic, repetitive, and structured around what appeared to be a 4-note pattern. Dr. Vance's initial analysis was cautious. "The waveform is consistent with a human voice," she wrote in her preliminary report. "The frequency and tonal qualities suggest a female vocal source. However, the playback speed required to bring the sound into normal human range indicates that the original production, if it is indeed vocal, would have occurred at approximately 1/3 the speed of normal human speech or song. In other words, whatever made the sound would have had to hum each note for roughly 3 times longer than any human could sustain." The team attempted to locate the source of the recording. They found nothing. No other hikers in the area, no equipment malfunctions, no natural explanation that satisfied their methodology. Dr. Vance submitted her findings to the Park Service in November of 2011 and requested funding for a follow-up study. The request was denied without explanation. When she inquired further, she was told that the Navajo Nation Historic Preservation Department had raised concerns about culturally sensitive research in the canyon. The recording was never officially released. Copies were reportedly sent to 2 academic institutions for independent analysis, but neither has published any findings. Dr. Vance left Arizona State in 2014 for a position at a private research firm. She has declined all interview requests regarding the Canyon de Chelly project. The original recording equipment was returned to the university. One of the memory cards, according to an inventory log, was listed as corrupted, data unrecoverable. The reports have continued. As recently as 2019, a photographer from Flagstaff described hearing the humming while hiking alone near the White House ruin trail junction. She followed it for several minutes before remembering the stories she had read online. "I stopped walking and just stood there," she said. "The sound stopped too. I waited maybe 5 minutes, not moving, not breathing, nothing. And then I turned around and walked back the way I came. I didn't run, I just walked. And I didn't hear it again." She paused before adding, "But I kept thinking, what if I hadn't stopped? How far would it have taken me?" The Chinle Wash still runs dry most of the year. The cottonwoods still drink from hidden springs. And somewhere upstream, just beyond the next bend, a woman is still humming 4 notes over and over, waiting for someone to follow. Some doors are sealed because of what lies behind them. Mummy Cave is one of the largest and most impressive cliff dwellings in Canyon de Chelly. It sits high in the eastern wall of Canyon del Muerto, the Canyon of the Dead, named for the ancient human remains Spanish explorers discovered there in 1804. The alcove stretches more than 400 feet across and shelters the ruins of approximately 50 rooms built by ancestral Puebloans between 900 and 1300 CE. A striking 3-story tower stands at its center, one of the best-preserved structures of its kind in the American Southwest. The site was first systematically documented by the Smithsonian Institution in 1893. Archaeologists have studied it extensively in the decades since, mapping its rooms, cataloging its artifacts, and piecing together the lives of the people who once called it home. Thousands of visitors view it each year from the overlook on the canyon rim, though access to the ruin itself is strictly controlled. What most visitors do not know, what most published sources do not mention, is that Mummy Cave contains areas that have never been fully surveyed. Beneath the visible ruins, carved into the sandstone at the back of the alcove, there are chambers that do not appear on any public map. The Park Service acknowledges their existence, but offers no information about their contents. The reason, according to official statements, is cultural sensitivity and preservation concerns. But the documents tell a different story, or rather, they don't tell it at all. In the autumn of 1934, the Civilian Conservation Corps was in the midst of its most ambitious period of work in the American Southwest. Young men from across the country were deployed to national parks and monuments, building trails, constructing facilities, and conducting surveys of archaeological sites. Canyon de Chelly, newly designated as a national monument in 1931, was a priority. A team of 7 men arrived at Mummy Cave on October 3rd under the supervision of a crew leader named Howard Gunderson. Their assignment, according to CCC records held at the National Archives, was to complete a comprehensive survey of the site, measuring structures, documenting conditions, and identifying areas in need of stabilization. The work was expected to take approximately 2 weeks. On October 19th, Gunderson submitted a 47-page report to the regional CCCC office in Flagstaff. The document was logged, assigned a file number, and forwarded to the Department of the Interior for review. Within 72 hours, it was classified. The circumstances surrounding this classification remain unclear. CCC survey reports were routine documents, typically filed in public archives and made available to researchers. Classification of such materials was virtually unheard of, particularly for a project involving no military significance or national security concerns. Yet the Mummy Cave Survey of 1934 has never been released. Freedom of Information Act requests submitted over the past 4 decades have been consistently denied, citing exemptions that apply to materials whose disclosure could cause damage to national security or unwarranted invasion of personal privacy. A 47-page survey of a prehistoric cliff dwelling, classified for 90 years. The only surviving reference to the report's contents comes from a handwritten note discovered in 1978 among the personal papers of Frederick Hollister, who served as the CCC District Coordinator for northeastern Arizona during the 1930s. The note, written in Gunderson's handwriting and addressed to Hollister, reads in full, "What we found in the lower chamber does not belong to any known period. I cannot explain it. Neither can the men. We recommend permanent closure and cessation of all further survey activity. This is not something that should be disturbed." The note is undated, but was filed with other correspondence from October of 1934. Efforts to locate Howard Gunderson after the survey proved difficult. CCC employment records show that he was transferred to a project in Northern California in November of 1934, less than a month after submitting his report. He left the CCCC entirely in 1936 and appears to have returned to his home state of Minnesota. A 1982 inquiry by a researcher at the University of Arizona located Gunderson's surviving daughter, then living in Duluth. She agreed to a brief telephone interview on the condition that her name not be published. "My father never talked about his time in Arizona," she said. "Not once. He kept a journal during those years. I found it after he passed in 1971. But the pages from October of 1934 were torn out. All of them. He'd removed them himself." When asked if her father had ever mentioned Mummy Cave or Canyon de Chelly, she hesitated. "Once," she said. "I was maybe 12 or 13. I asked him about a photograph I found, him and some other men standing in front of a big cliff. He looked at it for a long time, and then he said, 'Some places should stay closed.' That was all. He put the photograph away, and I never saw it again." The other 6 members of Gunderson's survey team have proven even harder to trace. CCC records indicate their names, but follow-up documentation is sparse. 2 appear to have died in World War II. One was institutionalized in a Veterans Administration hospital in 1946, though the reasons are not specified. The fates of the remaining 3 are unknown. In 1951, the National Park Service conducted a review of all archaeological sites within Canyon de Chelly National Monument. The review was led by Dr. Bernard Fontana, a respected archaeologist who would later become known for his work on Spanish colonial history in the Southwest. Fontana's report, completed in 1953, includes a brief reference to Mummy Cave's lower chambers. The relevant passage reads, "Access to the rear alcove and associated subterranean features has been restricted since 1935 by administrative order. The basis for this restriction is not documented in available files. Site inspection was not possible during this review. Fontana reportedly requested clarification from the Park Service Regional Office. His inquiry was never answered. In 1967, a graduate student from the University of New Mexico named Gerald Padilla attempted to include the lower chambers in his dissertation research on ancestral Puebloan architecture. His request for access was denied by the Park Service. His appeal to the Navajo Nation, which maintains joint jurisdiction over the monument, was also denied. "I was told it was a sacred site," Padilla recalled in a 2003 interview. "But when I asked Navajo elders about it, none of them seemed to know what I was talking about. One man, an older gentleman who had lived in the canyon his whole life, told me he'd never heard of anyone going into those chambers. Not his people, not the archaeologists, not anyone. He said it had been closed since before he was born. The administrative order referenced in Fontana's report has never been located. Park Service historians have searched for it repeatedly without success. The 1935 date suggests it was issued within months of Gunderson's survey, but no paper trail exists to confirm this. The lower chambers remained sealed. No photographs of their interior have ever been published. No inventory of their contents, if any, has ever been made public. When asked about the chambers during a 2016 interview, a retired Park Service archaeologist who had worked at Canyon de Chelly for more than 20 years chose his words carefully. "There are places in the canyon that aren't on the maps," he said. "That doesn't mean they don't exist. It just means someone decided a long time ago that they shouldn't be documented." He paused before adding, "I don't know what's in there. I never asked. Some questions you learn not to ask." Howard Gunderson's note remains in the University of Arizona's special collections, preserved in an acid-free folder alongside other materials from the Hollister papers. Researchers can view it by appointment. The handwriting is neat, the ink faded to brown, the paper has yellowed with age. This is not something that should be disturbed. 90 years later, it hasn't been. The lower chamber at Mummy Cave remains sealed, not by stone or mortar, but by silence. Whatever Gunderson and his men found. In October of 1934, whatever filled those 47 pages that no one has ever read, whatever made a young crew leader recommend permanent closure of a site that had stood open for 700 years, it remains exactly where they left it, undisturbed, undocumented, waiting. Some people vanish. Others return at the wrong time. Spider Rock rises 800 feet from the canyon floor like a needle made of stone. The Navajo call it Tse-na-ash-je-i, and their stories say that Spider Woman lives at its summit, a deity who taught the people to weave, but who also carries misbehaving children to the top, where their bleached bones can still be seen. Whether the white streaks on the spire are mineral deposits or something else depends on who you ask. The overlook that faces it sits along the South Rim Drive, a paved scenic route that winds through Canyon de Chelly National Monument in northeastern Arizona. On clear days, visitors can see for miles in every direction the red walls of the canyon, the distant mesas, the thin ribbon of Chinlawash far below. It is one of the most photographed locations in the American Southwest. It is also one of the most carefully watched. The canyon drops more than 800 feet at the overlook's edge, and the sandstone is soft, prone to crumbling. Warning signs line the perimeter. Rangers patrol regularly during peak season. Despite these precautions, people have disappeared here. Not many. Canyon de Chelly is not known for a high rate of missing persons, but enough that the Park Service maintains files on each case. Most are eventually resolved. Hikers who wandered off trail and were found days later. Tourists who suffered medical emergencies and were recovered by search teams. The occasional suicide, though these are rarely publicized out of respect for the families. But one case has never been closed, and what happened 31 years after it began has never been explained. Gerald Raymond Fitch arrived at Canyon de Chelly on the morning of August 15, 1972. He was 53 years old, a recently retired insurance adjuster from Dayton, Ohio, traveling alone through the Southwest in a beige 1970 Chevrolet pickup. He had checked into a motel in Chinle the previous evening and told the desk clerk he planned to spend a few days exploring the monument before continuing on to the Grand Canyon. According to Park Service entry records, Fitch arrived at the South Rim Visitor Center at approximately 9:45 in the morning. He purchased a map, asked a ranger about the best overlooks for photography, and mentioned that he was particularly interested in Spider Rock. The ranger, A seasonal employee named Dolores Manigoats gave him directions and reminded him to stay behind the safety barriers. Fitch's truck was found in the Spider Rock Overlook parking lot at 6:15 that evening. His camera, wallet, and car keys were inside. His map was spread across the passenger seat, folded open to the South Rim Drive page. A half-eaten sandwich sat on the dashboard, still wrapped in wax paper. Gerald Fitch was never seen again. The search lasted 9 days. Rangers scoured the canyon floor. Helicopters swept the rim and the surrounding mesa country. Navajo trackers examined every trail leading away from the overlook. They found no footprints beyond the established paths, no clothing, no evidence of a fall. The case was classified as a probable accident, a visitor who had ventured too close to the edge and fallen, though no body was ever recovered. The canyon is deep. The terrain is unforgiving. Sometimes the desert keeps what it takes. The file remained open but inactive. Gerald Fitch became a statistic, a name on a list of the missing that no one expected to see again. 31 years passed. On September 23, 2003, a retired schoolteacher from Flagstaff named Miriam Ostrowski visited Spider Rock Overlook with her husband, Frank. They had been to Canyon de Chelly many times before and considered it one of their favorite places in Arizona. The weather was clear, the crowds thin. Miriam brought her digital camera, still a relative novelty at the time, and took several dozen photographs of the canyon and the distant spire. It was not until she reviewed the images at home that she noticed something unusual. In one photograph, taken facing southeast toward the canyon rim, a man stood alone near the edge of the overlook. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, dressed in clothing that struck Miriam as slightly dated: brown slacks, a beige button-down shirt, leather shoes rather than hiking boots. His hands were clasped in front of him. His face was turned slightly away from the camera. Miriam did not remember seeing anyone matching that description during their visit. Neither did Frank. "I almost deleted it," she said in a 2009 interview with the researcher from Northern Arizona University. "I thought maybe he'd just walked into the frame without me noticing. But something about him seemed off. He didn't look like a tourist. He looked like he was waiting for something." On a whim, Miriam posted the photograph to an online forum dedicated to Canyon de Chelly history. She asked if anyone recognized the man or could explain his unusual clothing. Within 48 hours, she received a response that changed everything. A user with the screen name Chelly Archivist replied with a scanned image from a 1972 missing persons file. It was a photograph of Gerald Fitch, taken approximately 2 years before his disappearance. The resemblance was not subtle. It was exact. The same build, the same posture, the same hairline, the same set of the jaw. And on the left hand of the man in Miriam's photograph, visible, despite the image's modest resolution, a pale, curved scar running from the base of the thumb to the wrist. Gerald Fitch's missing persons file noted that he bore a distinctive scar on his left hand, the result of a childhood accident involving broken glass. Jotter. The photograph was examined by 3 separate analysts over the following years. None could find evidence of manipulation. The metadata confirmed it was taken on September 23, 2003 at 11:47 in the morning. The camera model, exposure settings, and file structure were all consistent with Miriam Ostrowski's other photographs from that day. A forensic comparison conducted in 2006 concluded that the man in the 2003 photograph and Gerald Fitch shared an unusually high number of corresponding facial features. The analysts stopped short of declaring a definitive match. Without higher resolution or additional angles, certainty was impossible, but noted that the probability of 2 unrelated individuals sharing such precise characteristics was statistically remote. The Park Service declined to comment on the photograph. A Freedom of Information Act request filed in 2008 for any records related to Gerald Fitch's disappearance was partially granted, but several pages were withheld under an exemption for investigative techniques and procedures. What investigative techniques could apply to a case that had been dormant for more than 3 decades was not explained. Researchers attempted to locate Gerald Fitch's surviving family members. His wife had died in 1989. They had no children. A nephew in Columbus, Ohio, confirmed that Fitch had never been found and that the family had held a memorial service in 1974, 2 years after his disappearance. "We assumed he fell," the nephew said. "That's what the rangers told us. They said the canyon doesn't always give people back." When shown Miriam Ostrowski's photograph, the nephew studied it for a long time before responding. "That's him," he said quietly. "That's Uncle Gerald. I don't know how, but that's him." He paused. "He looks exactly the way I remember him from when I was a kid, before he disappeared." Miriam Ostrowski returned to Spider Rock Overlook in 2011. She brought her camera and spent 3 hours at the site, photographing every angle, watching every visitor. She saw nothing unusual. No man in dated clothing, no figure standing alone at the edge. But she noticed something she had not registered before, a small bronze plaque mounted on a stone near the Overlook's entrance, listing the names of individuals who had been lost in the canyon over the years. Gerald Raymond Fitch's name was there, along with a date, August 15, 1972, the day he vanished. 31 years before a man who looked exactly like him, who bore the same scar, the same face, the same unaged features, appeared in a photograph taken at the same spot where he was last seen. The Park Service has never updated Gerald Fitch's file. The case remains officially open, classified as an unresolved disappearance. But sometimes, visitors to Spider Rock Overlook report seeing a man standing alone near the edge, dressed in brown slacks and a beige shirt, his hands clasped in front of him, his face turned slightly away. He is always gone before anyone can speak to him. He is always waiting for something that never arrives. The ancients left messages we were never meant to decode. Antelope House stands in the shadow of Cañon del Muerto's northern wall, its name derived from the painted antelope figures that decorate a nearby cliff face. The ruin dates to approximately 1100 CE, though people lived in this alcove for centuries before the visible structures were built. At its peak, the site housed perhaps 50 to 60 inhabitants in a cluster of rooms that climbed the alcove's sloping floor like steps. Today, only crumbling walls remain, sandstone and mortar slowly returning to the earth from which they came. The canyon itself stretches more than 25 miles through the Navajo Nation in northeastern Arizona. Its walls rise as high as 1,000 feet, layered red and orange stone that glows like embers in the late afternoon light. The ancestral Puebloans who built Antelope House chose their location with care. The alcove faces south, capturing winter sun while remaining shaded during the brutal summer months. A spring once flowed nearby. The soil along the wash was fertile enough to grow corn, beans, and squash. They also left their marks on the stone, hundreds of petroglyphs and pictographs scattered throughout the canyon, carved and painted onto rock surfaces that have endured for nearly 1,000 years. Some depict animals, others show human figures, geometric patterns, or symbols whose meanings have been lost to time. Archaeologists have cataloged many of these images, but the canyon is vast, and new discoveries continue to emerge. Most are considered art or ritual or record-keeping, simple explanations for ancient marks. But in 2016, a young researcher found something that suggested the petroglyphs might be more than decoration, that they might be a map pointing to something that was never meant to be found. Valeria Sandoval was 26 years old when she arrived at Cañon de Chelly in the spring of 2016. A doctoral candidate in archaeoastronomy at the University of Colorado, she was researching the relationship between ancestral Puebloan rock art and celestial alignments. Her thesis proposed that certain petroglyphs functioned as astronomical markers, indicators of solstices, equinoxes, and lunar cycles that helped ancient peoples track time and seasons. Antelope House was one of several sites she planned to survey. The ruins' petroglyphs were well documented, and previous researchers had noted possible solar alignments at the site. Sandoval intended to expand on this work using modern mapping technology and three-dimensional imaging software. Over the course of 3 weeks, she photographed and cataloged more than 200 individual petroglyphs at and around Antelope House. She recorded their precise GPS coordinates, their orientation relative to the sun's path, and their relationships to nearby structures and landscape features. It was during the data analysis phase back in her office in Boulder that she noticed the pattern. 5 petroglyphs, scattered across different sections of the Antelope House complex, shared an unusual characteristic. Each depicted a spiral with exactly 7 coils, rotating clockwise, with a small dot at the center. Spirals were common in ancestral Puebloan rock art, but this specific configuration, 7 coils, clockwise rotation, central dot, appeared nowhere else in her survey. When Sandoval plotted the GPS coordinates of these 5 spirals on a topographic map, the result was striking. The points formed a near-perfect pentagon, with each side measuring approximately 140 meters. The geometric precision was far beyond what random placement could explain. More significantly, the lines connecting these 5 points, when extended to their convergence, intersected at a single location deep in a side canyon approximately 2 miles northwest of Antelope House, an area that, according to official maps, contained nothing of archaeological interest. Sandoval brought her findings to her thesis advisor, Dr. Martin Redhorse, a specialist in Southwest archaeology who had worked extensively in Canyon de Chelly during the 1990s. His initial reaction was cautious enthusiasm. The geometry was remarkable, Redhorse recalled in a 2019 interview. I'd seen claims of intentional alignments before. Most of them don't hold up under scrutiny. But Valeria's data was solid. The precision of that pentagon was difficult to dismiss as coincidence. He encouraged her to submit a formal request to the Park Service and the Navajo Nation Historic Preservation Department for permission to survey the convergence point, the location where the extended lines met. The response came 6 weeks later. Both requests were denied. The Park Service cited resource protection concerns and noted that the area in question was not currently open to research activity. The Navajo Nation's reply was shorter. The location identified in your request falls within a culturally restricted zone. No research permits will be issued at this time. Sandoval appealed both decisions. She provided additional documentation, offered to conduct a surface survey only with no excavation, and proposed partnering with Navajo archaeologists to ensure cultural protocols were followed. Both appeals were denied without further explanation. It was like hitting a wall, Sandoval said in a rare 2018 interview with an independent archaeology blog. I wasn't asking to dig anything up. I just wanted to walk the ground and see if there was anything there. They wouldn't even let me do that. When she pressed for more information about why the area was restricted, she received no response. Sandoval attempted to find alternative routes to her research. She contacted colleagues who had worked in the canyon, hoping someone might have knowledge of the convergence site or could advocate on her behalf. Most were sympathetic but unhelpful. A few offered informal observations that only deepened the mystery. One retired Park Service archaeologist, who spoke on condition of anonymity, told her that the location she had identified appeared on internal maps as a management exclusion zone, a designation typically reserved for sites with active preservation concerns or ongoing cultural sensitivity issues. But when she asked what specifically was being preserved or protected, he could not say. "I worked in that canyon for 15 years, he told her. "I never set foot in that area. None of us did. It was just understood that you didn't go there." Another contact, a Navajo cultural specialist who had consulted on several projects in Canyon de Chelly, offered a different perspective. "There are places in the canyon that belong to the holy people," he said. "They're not on any map because they're not meant to be visited. Some things were put there a long time ago, before the Spanish, before anyone. The old ones knew where those places were. They marked them so their children would remember." When Sandoval asked if the petroglyphs might be those markers, he did not answer directly. "If you found what you say you found," he said carefully, "then maybe you should ask yourself why no one found it before you." Sandoval's thesis, initially scheduled for completion in 2017, was never finished. University records indicate that she requested a leave of absence in the fall of that year and did not return. Her academic advisor confirmed that her research materials were returned to the department, but her analysis files and field notes were not among them. Attempts to contact Sandoval for this account were unsuccessful. Her last known address was in Albuquerque. Neighbors reported that she moved out in early 2018 without leaving forwarding information. The 5 petroglyphs remain at Antelope House, unchanged and unremarkable to casual observers. Park Service documentation makes no mention of their geometric relationship. The convergence point they indicate, the place where the lines of the Pentagon meet, does not appear in any public archaeological survey. Satellite imagery of the area shows nothing unusual: bare rock, scattered vegetation, the dry bed of a seasonal wash. If anything lies there, it is hidden from view. But the geometry holds. Anyone with the coordinates can plot the points themselves: 5 spirals, 7 coils each, clockwise rotation, central dot. Connect them on a map, extend the lines. They still meet at the same place. A place no one is allowed to visit. A place no one will explain. Valeria Sandoval understood what she had found. Perhaps that understanding is why she stopped looking, or perhaps she learned something else. Something that made her realize the ancient markers were not an invitation. They were a warning, and some warnings, carved in stone 1,000 years ago, still hold their power today. For 3 minutes, the world forgot how to speak. Tsegi Overlook sits along the North Rim Drive of Canyon de Chelly National Monument, offering one of the most expansive views in the entire park system. From the overlook's edge, visitors can see nearly 7 miles of canyon stretching toward the northeast. A labyrinth of red sandstone walls, cottonwood groves, and ancient ruins tucked into alcoves that have sheltered human beings for more than 4,000 years. The Navajo word tsegi means rock canyon, and the name fits. Stone dominates everything here. It shapes the land, holds the heat, carries sound in unpredictable ways across the vast open spaces. The monument was established in 1931, though the Navajo have lived in and around the canyon for centuries. Unlike most national parks, Canyon de Chelly remains Navajo land, jointly administered by the tribe and the National Park Service. Families still farm the canyon floor, tending orchards and livestock in the same places their ancestors did. The relationship between the land and its people is not historical. It is ongoing, unbroken, alive. The canyon is also known for its acoustic properties. Sound behaves strangely between the high walls. Echoes return at unexpected intervals, sometimes louder than the original sound, sometimes not at all. Visitors have reported hearing conversations from miles away, carried on currents of air that seem to follow rules of their own. Rangers learn quickly that the canyon plays tricks, that what you hear is not always what is there. But what happened on the morning of September 14, 1958, was not a trick. It was something else entirely. And more than 60 years later, no one has been able to explain it. The first written account of the incident came from a schoolteacher named Dorothy Whitman, who was visiting from Gallup, New Mexico, with her husband and 2 children. They arrived at Sigi Overlook at approximately 9:15 in the morning. The weather was clear, the temperature mild. A handful of other visitors were already present, perhaps 8 or 10 people in total, according to later estimates. Whitman's account, written in a letter to her sister 3 days after the event, describes what happened next. We had been standing at the railing for perhaps 5 minutes, taking photographs and pointing out the ruins to the children. Henry was explaining something about the geology when I noticed that I could no longer hear him. His mouth was moving, but there was no sound. I thought something had happened to my ears, that I had gone deaf suddenly. But then I looked around and saw that everyone else had stopped talking too. They were all looking at each other with the strangest expressions. The silence, according to Whitman, lasted approximately 3 minutes. During that time, she could hear nothing, not the wind, not the birds that had been circling. Moments earlier, not even the sound of her own breathing. She described a pressure in her ears, similar to the sensation of descending in an airplane, and an overwhelming feeling that something was watching them from the canyon below. "I have never felt anything like it," she wrote. "It was as if the whole world had been put on pause, and there was this feeling, I cannot describe it properly, that we were not alone, that something down in the canyon was aware of us, aware that we were there." When the sound returned, it came back all at once. Wind, birds, voices, everything resuming as if someone had turned a dial. Several visitors reported feeling disoriented. One woman sat down on the ground and refused to move for several minutes. A child began crying, though he could not explain why. The Whitmans left the Overlook shortly after the incident and reported their experience to a ranger at the visitor center. According to Park Service records, at least 5 other groups filed similar accounts that morning, all describing the same sudden silence, the same duration, the same physical sensations. Robert Yellowhair, a Navajo guide who was leading a group of tourists through the canyon floor at the time, offered a different perspective. He was approximately 3 miles from Sigi Overlook when the silence occurred, and he experienced it from below rather than above. "The horses stopped first," he said in a 1982 interview with a researcher from the University of Arizona. "They just stopped walking and stood there with their ears back. Then I noticed the quiet. No birds, no wind, nothing. It was like being inside a sealed room, except we were outside under open sky." Yellowhair described looking up toward the rim and seeing the visitors at the overlook, tiny figures standing motionless at the edge. "They weren't moving," he said. "None of them. They were just standing there, like statues. And I remember thinking, this is wrong. Something is very wrong." The silence lasted what he estimated to be 2 or 3 minutes. When it ended, the horses bolted. It took Yellowhair nearly an hour to calm them enough to continue the tour. He never spoke publicly about the incident again until the 1982 interview, which was conducted on the condition that his full name not be used. "There are things in the canyon that don't belong to us," he said. "Things that were here before the DNA, before anyone. Sometimes they remind us that we're guests here. That's what I think happened that morning." The Park Service response to the incident was notably muted. A brief internal memo, dated September 16, 1958, acknowledged that multiple visitors reported an unusual acoustic phenomenon at Sigi Overlook on the morning of September 14th. The memo recommended continued monitoring, but concluded that no further action is warranted at this time. No follow-up reports were filed. No scientific investigation was conducted. The incident does not appear in any published history of Canyon de Chelly National Monument. But something else happened that afternoon, something that has proven even harder to explain. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon on September 14th, multiple witnesses reported seeing a military helicopter circling the canyon near Chelly Overlook. The aircraft made several passes at low altitude before departing to the southeast. One witness, a retired Army officer named Franklin Morrow, identified it as a Sikorsky H-19, a model commonly used by the Air Force for search and rescue operations. Morrow reported the sighting to the Park Service, assuming it was part of a training exercise or emergency response. He was told that no military aircraft had been authorized to operate in the area that day. A Freedom of Information Act request filed in 1991 sought records of any military flights over Canyon de Chelly on September 14, 1958. The response, received 14 months later, stated that no records matching your request criteria were located in Department of Defense archives. The helicopter, officially, was never there, yet multiple witnesses saw it. Morrow photographed it, a single black and white image showing a distant aircraft against the canyon rim. The photograph was included in his personal papers donated to the Arizona Historical Society after his death in 2001. Archivists have verified its authenticity. The aircraft is clearly visible, but according to every official record, it does not exist. Dorothy Whitman never returned to Canyon de Chelly. In a letter written to her sister several years later, she mentioned the incident only once, noting that she still thought about it from time to time. "I have told very few people what happened that morning," she wrote. "Most would not believe me. Sometimes I am not sure I believe it myself, but I know what I felt. I know what I heard, or rather, what I did not hear. And I know that something was watching us from down in that canyon. Something that wanted us to know it was there." Chelly Overlook remains one of the most visited sites in Canyon de Chelly. Thousands of people stand at its edge every year, looking out over the ancient landscape, listening to the wind and the birds and the distant echoes that bounce between the walls. None of them know what happened there on September 14, 1958. The Park Service has never acknowledged it. The military has never explained the helicopter. The Navajo guides who remember that day have mostly passed on, taking their stories with them. But the canyon remembers. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when the air is still and the light falls just right, visitors at Chelly Overlook report a strange sensation, a feeling of pressure in their ears, a momentary hush that seems to swallow all sound. It never lasts more than a few seconds, but for those few seconds, the world holds its breath, and something below seems to be listening. She is always there at dusk, and she is always looking away. Junction Overlook marks the point where Canyon de Chelly and Canyon del Muerto meet, their sandstone walls converging like the fingers of two ancient hands. The viewpoint sits along the South Rim Drive, accessible by a short paved path from a small parking area. On clear evenings, the setting sun paints the canyon walls in shades of copper and gold, and the shadows stretch long across the valley floor more than 500 feet below. It is one of the most photographed locations in the monument, and one of the most visited. Canyon de Chelly has been inhabited for nearly 5,000 years. The ancestral Puebloans built their cliff dwellings here. The Navajo arrived centuries later and never left. The canyon has witnessed births and deaths, ceremonies and massacres, the slow turning of seasons across millennia. Some places accumulate history like sediment. This is one of them. The overlook itself is unremarkable: a metal railing, a few interpretive signs, a worn patch of ground where thousands of feet have stood. During the day, it bustles with tourists. But at dusk, when the parking lot empties and the light begins to fail, the place takes on a different character. The silence deepens, the shadows thicken, and sometimes, according to those who have been there at the right hour, a woman appears. She wears a yellow coat, faded, the color of old mustard or dried desert grass. She stands near the edge of the overlook facing the canyon, her back to whoever might be watching. And when you try to reach her, she is gone. The first documented report came in October of 1991. A couple from Tucson, Raymond and Eileen Kowalski, were returning to the parking lot after watching the sunset when Eileen noticed a figure standing at the far end of the overlook. "I thought it was strange that someone else was still there," she said in a written statement provided to the Park Service. It was getting dark and most people had already left. But there was this woman just standing at the railing. She was wearing a yellow coat, a rain jacket maybe, or a windbreaker. It looked old, faded. Eileen called out to the woman asking if she was all right. The woman did not respond. She did not turn around. Raymond began walking toward her, concerned that she might be in distress. He estimated the distance at roughly 40 feet. When he was halfway there, he said, "The woman simply was not there anymore." "I don't mean she walked away," he clarified. "I mean she was gone. I looked down to watch my footing for maybe 2 seconds, and when I looked up, she wasn't there. There was nowhere for her to go. The railing was still there. The canyon was still there, but she was gone." The Kowalskis reported the incident to a ranger the following morning. They were told that no one matching that description had been seen in the area and that the overlook had been empty when staff conducted their evening patrol. Raymond Kowalski remained unsettled by the experience for years. In a 2004 interview with a researcher compiling accounts of unusual events in national parks, he said simply, "I know what I saw. I don't know what it means, but I know she was there." Over the next 17 years, at least 6 additional reports described the same figure. The details varied slightly. Some said the coat was mustard yellow, others described it as pale gold, but the core elements remained consistent. A woman, a yellow coat, standing at the edge, facing away, gone before anyone could reach her. In 1996, a solo hiker named Marcus Delgado reported seeing the figure while returning from the canyon floor at twilight. He watched her for nearly a minute from the trail below before beginning his ascent to the overlook. When he arrived, the viewpoint was empty. "I could see her clearly from down in the canyon," he said. "She was standing right at the edge, not moving. I thought maybe she was meditating or something, but when I got up there, there was no one. No footprints in the dust, no sign anyone had been there at all." In 2003, a family from Colorado photographed the overlook at sunset. When they reviewed their images later, one frame showed a blurred yellow shape near the railing that none of them remembered seeing. The photograph was submitted to the Park Service, but was never returned. Teresa Nez, a Navajo artist who grew up near Chelly, recalled hearing stories about the woman in the yellow coat from her grandmother in the late 1980s, years before the first official report. She said there was a woman who came to that place to grieve, Nez explained in a 2011 interview. Someone who lost something, a child maybe, or a husband. The old people said she was still looking for what she lost, that she would always be looking. When asked if she believed the stories, Nez paused before answering. "I believe there are places where grief stays longer than it should," she said. "I believe some people leave something behind when they go, whether that's a ghost or just a memory. I don't know. But something is there, something that doesn't want to leave." The Park Service has never issued an official statement regarding the sightings at Junction Overlook. Internal records obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request in 2012 show that reports involving unidentified female figure or woman in yellow were logged in the monument's incident database between 1991 and 2008, but no investigations were conducted. In 2009, a ranger named Paul Etcity gave an interview to a small weekly newspaper in Chelly. The article, published in the paper's October issue, focused on local folklore and unusual stories from the canyon. Near the end of the piece, Chelly mentioned the woman in the yellow coat. "We've had reports over the years," he said. "Visitors see a woman at Junction Overlook, always at dusk, always in a yellow coat. They try to approach her, and she's gone. It happens often enough that we have a protocol for it." When the interviewer asked what the protocol was, Chelly hesitated. "We don't respond," he said. "We log it, but we don't send anyone out. Management told us years ago, if someone reports the yellow coat, we note it and move on. We don't investigate. We don't discuss it with the public." The article appeared in print on October 15, 2009. By October 22nd, it had been removed from the newspaper's website. Archived copies of that issue are missing from the Chelly Public Library. The newspaper's editor at the time declined to comment, saying only that certain content was removed at the request of federal partners. Paul Chelly was transferred to a Park Service position in Utah the following spring. He has not spoken publicly about the incident since. Efforts to identify the woman, to connect the sightings to a missing person, a historical figure, or a documented death at the Overlook have produced nothing. No one matching the description has been reported missing in the area. No bodies have been recovered from that section of the canyon. No explanation has ever been offered. Junction Overlook remains open to visitors. Thousands of people stand at its railing every year, watching the sunset, photographing the confluence of two ancient canyons, feeling the cool desert air as the light fades. Most of them see nothing unusual, but a few, always at dusk, always when the parking lot is nearly empty, report the same thing. A woman in a faded yellow coat, standing at the edge, facing away, silent. They call out. They walk toward her. They blink or look down or turn to gesture to a companion. And when they look back, she is gone. No one knows who she is. No one knows what she is waiting for, and no one at the Park Service will say why they were told years ago never to respond to reports about the yellow coat. The canyon holds its secrets in layers: geological, historical, human. Some are written in stone, others are written in silence, and some stand at the edge of an overlook at dusk, facing away, waiting for something that may never come. The trail is always longer than the map says it should be. Sliding House Ruin clings to the northern wall of Canyon de Chelly, its ancient stone rooms appearing to slide down the sloping rock face from which they were built. The site dates to approximately 1100 CE, constructed by the ancestral Puebloans who inhabited these canyons for centuries before their mysterious departure. The name comes from the ruins' precarious appearance. The structures seem frozen in the act of falling, held in place by gravity and time and the patience of stone. The trail to the overlook is short by park standards, less than a mile round trip, descending approximately 300 feet through switchbacks carved into the sandstone. Most visitors complete the hike in under an hour. The path is well maintained, clearly marked, and visible from above for nearly its entire length. There are no forks, no alternative routes, no places where a hiker might accidentally wander off course. Canyon de Chelly has been inhabited continuously for nearly 5,000 years. The Navajo who live here today consider the land sacred, and access to most areas requires a permit and an authorized guide. But the Sliding House Trail is one of the few self-guided routes in the monument, open to visitors who want to experience the canyon without an escort. Most of them return without incident. But some come back with stories that are difficult to explain. Stories about a trail that seems to stretch beyond its measured length, about steps that don't add up, about time that slips away without warning. And always, the same number appears: 37. The first documented account came in August of 1989. A retired mathematics teacher from Albuquerque named Harold Pemberton was hiking the trail alone when he decided, out of professional habit, to count his steps. He had measured trails this way for years, a mental exercise, a way to stay engaged on familiar terrain. The descent should have taken approximately 600 steps, based on his stride length and the trail's documented distance. Pemberton was meticulous. He counted carefully, resetting at each switchback to avoid losing track. When he reached the overlook at Sliding House Ruin, his count stood at 637. "I assumed I'd made an error," he wrote in a letter to the Park Service 3 weeks later. "Perhaps I double-counted somewhere or lost track during a steep section, but when I hiked back up, counting again, I got exactly 600 steps. The correct number. The descent had taken 37 more." Pemberton dismissed it as a curiosity until he arrived home and checked his watch. He had departed the trailhead at 10:15 in the morning. His wife, waiting at the parking area, confirmed that he returned at 11:40, 1 hour and 25 minutes later. The trail should have taken no more than 45 minutes round trip. Pemberton had lost approximately 40 minutes. He had no memory of stopping, no recollection of resting or taking photographs. He simply had less time than the hike should have required. "I felt fine physically," he wrote, "but something was wrong. I could feel it. There was a gap somewhere, a piece missing that I couldn't account for." He never hiked the trail again. Sarah. Over the following decades, similar accounts emerged, never in large numbers, never consistently enough to establish a pattern, but persistent enough to attract attention from those who listened carefully. A college student named Anita Reyes reported the phenomenon in 2001 after hiking the trail with her boyfriend. She had been counting steps as a game, something to pass the time, when she realized the descent had taken longer than expected. "I counted 642 steps down," she said in an interview with a researcher several years later. "My boyfriend wasn't counting, but he noticed too. He said it felt like we'd been walking forever, like the trail just kept going. And when we got to the bottom, we both felt strange, dizzy, like we'd just woken up from a nap." When asked if she had experienced any memory gaps, Reyes hesitated. "There's a part I don't remember clearly," she admitted. "Somewhere in the middle, the second or third switchback, I think. I remember starting down, and I remember reaching the ruin, but the middle is fuzzy, like trying to remember a dream." Her boyfriend, contacted separately, corroborated her account. He had not counted steps, but estimated the hike had taken at least twice as long as it should have. Neither could explain the discrepancy. A Navajo guide named Leonard Blackwater, who had worked in the canyon for more than 30 years, offered a different perspective when interviewed in 2007. "The old people used to say that trail was different," he said. "They said it went somewhere else before it went to the ruin, that if you walked it wrong, if you counted, or if you paid too much attention, you might end up taking the long way." When asked what the long way meant, Blackwater shook his head. "I don't know. They never explained it. They just said you shouldn't count your steps on that trail, that some distances aren't meant to be measured." In 2004, a research team from the University of Arizona's Department of Psychology proposed a study to investigate reports of spatial and temporal disorientation at Sliding House Ruin. The project was led by Dr. Catherine Moreau, a cognitive scientist specializing in perception and navigation. Moreau's team planned to monitor hikers using GPS trackers, heart rate monitors, and structured interviews before and after each descent. The goal was to determine whether the reported anomalies could be explained by environmental factors, altitude, heat, dehydration, or whether something more unusual was occurring. The study received initial approval from the Park Service and the Navajo Nation Historic Preservation Department. Funding was secured through a university research grant. Equipment was purchased and calibrated. Then, in March of 2004, 3 weeks before data collection was scheduled to begin, the project was canceled. The official reason, according to university records, was loss of funding due to budgetary reallocation. But internal documents obtained through a public records request tell a different story. A memo dated March 12, 2004, from the university's Research Compliance Office states that the project was suspended pending further review due to concerns raised by partnering agencies. The nature of those concerns is not specified. The memo recommends that no further communication regarding this project be issued to external parties. Dr. Moreau left the university the following year. She has declined all requests for interviews regarding the sliding house study. Her research files were not transferred to her successor, and their current location, if they still exist, is unknown. The Park Service, when asked about the canceled study in 2011, responded only that the proposed research was not completed due to logistical constraints. No further details were provided. The GPS trackers, heart rate monitors, and interview protocols were never used. Whatever data might have explained the 37 steps was never collected, or if it was never released. The trail to Sliding House Ruin remains open. Thousands of visitors hike it every year, descending the switchbacks to view the ancient ruin and returning without incident. Most of them do not count their steps. But those who do, those who pay attention, who measure the distance with their feet and their minds, sometimes find that the numbers do not match. That the trail is longer going down than coming up. That time moves differently in the space between the rim and the ruin. 37 steps. Always 37. No one knows why the number is consistent. No one knows where those extra steps lead or what happens during the minutes that hikers cannot remember. The canyon keeps its secrets, as it always has, in layers of stone and silence and time. Harold Pemberton, in his final letter to the Park Service, posed a question that has never been answered. If I took 37 steps that weren't on the trail, he wrote, then where was I walking? And if I lost 40 minutes that I can't remember, what was I doing during that time? The Park Service never replied. The trail remains 600 steps long, according to every official measurement. But some distances, as Leonard Blackwater said, are not meant to be measured, and some steps lead to places that do not appear on any map. Someone was transmitting from a place where no transmitter should exist. Massacre Cave sits high in the eastern wall of Canyon del Muerto, approximately 600 feet above the valley floor. The alcove earned its grim name in 1805, when Spanish soldiers under Lieutenant Antonio Narbona attacked a group of Navajo who had taken refuge in the cave. Estimates of the dead range from 90 to 115, mostly women, children, and elderly who could not flee. The Navajo call the place Ada Ahodunili, which translates roughly to two fell off. It refers to two warriors who, according to oral tradition, leapt from the cave rather than surrender. The site has been known to archaeologists since the late 19th century. It contains evidence of human habitation dating back more than 1,000 years. Ancestral Puebloan structures, pottery fragments, and rock art that predates the massacre by centuries. Access is restricted both for cultural reasons and because the terrain is treacherous. The climb requires technical skill and explicit permission from the Navajo Nation. Canyon del Muerto, the Canyon of the Dead, extends roughly 18 miles northeast of the main canyon system. It is quieter than Canyon de Chelly proper, less visited, more remote. The sandstone walls absorb sound in unpredictable ways. Radio signals behave erratically. Cell phones, in the modern era, rarely find service. The canyon exists in a kind of electromagnetic shadow, cut off from the networks that connect the rest of the world, which is why what happened in the autumn of 1977 remains so difficult to explain. The geology team arrived on October the 3rd, 1977, under contract with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Their assignment was to assess erosion patterns along the canyon walls, particularly in areas where ancient structures might be at risk of collapse. The team consisted of 4 researchers from the University of New Mexico, led by a senior geologist named Dr. Franklin Ortega. They established a base camp near the mouth of Canyon del Muerto and spent the first week conducting surface surveys. Radio communication was essential. The canyon's depth made visual signaling impractical, and the team relied on handheld transceivers to coordinate their movements. On the evening of October 11th, a junior researcher named David Running Horse was monitoring the base radio while the rest of the team completed their fieldwork. At approximately 6:45 in the evening, he picked up an unusual signal. "It came through on a frequency we weren't using," Running Horse said in a 1992 interview with a journalist researching unexplained radio phenomena. "I thought it was interference at first, maybe a trucker on the highway or a ham operator bleeding through, but it was too clear for that, too close." The voice was male, speaking in Navajo. Running Horse, who was himself Navajo and fluent in the language, recognized the words immediately. Numbers. The voice was reading a sequence of numbers slowly and deliberately, pausing for several seconds between each one. 4, 17, 9, 32, 11. The sequence continued for approximately 3 minutes before stopping. Then silence, not static, but complete silence, as if the transmission had been cut cleanly. Running Horse recorded approximately 90 seconds of the broadcast on a portable tape recorder before the signal ended. When Dr. Ortega returned to camp, Running Horse played the recording for him. Ortega, according to his field notes, found the signal unusual but not necessarily significant. He assumed it was a number station, a type of shortwave broadcast used by intelligence agencies during the Cold War to transmit coded messages. Such stations were known to exist, though they typically operated on shortwave frequencies, not the VHF band the team was using. The team continued their work. The signal did not return. 3 days later, federal agents arrived at their camp. The agents identified themselves as representatives of the Federal Communications Commission, though Running Horse later expressed doubt about this claim. "They didn't act like FCC," he said. "They were too serious, too organized. They had questions about the signal, when we heard it, what frequency, how long it lasted. They wanted to know if we'd told anyone else." The agents confiscated all radio equipment belonging to the team, including the portable tape recorder containing Running Horse's recording. They provided receipts but offered no explanation. When Dr. Ortega protested, he was told that the equipment would be returned after analysis. It never was. Ortega filed multiple inquiries with the FCC over the following months. Each was met with the same response. No record of any confiscation in the Canyon de Chelly area existed in their files. The agents, whoever they were, had left no official trace. Running Horse attempted to reconstruct the number sequence from memory. He recalled some of it, 4, 17, 9, 32, but could not be certain of the order or whether he had captured the complete transmission. "I listened to it several times before they took it," he said. The voice was calm, almost mechanical, like someone reading from a script. But there was something else, something underneath the words, a kind of hum, very faint. I don't know if it was interference or something in the cave. When asked what he meant by something in the cave, Running Horse paused. "The signal was coming from Massacre Cave, he said. I'm certain of it, the direction, the strength. It was coming from inside the canyon, not outside. But there's nothing up there, no equipment, no power source, nothing." A Navajo elder named Agnes So, who lived near the canyon during that period, offered a different, bait interpretation when interviewed in 2005. "The old ones used to say that place holds voices," she said, "voices of the people who died there. Maybe they were trying to say something. Maybe they found a way to speak. She declined to elaborate further. 2. Efforts to verify or explain the broadcast have produced no conclusive results. The FCC has no record of any investigation in the area during 1977. The Bureau of Indian Affairs confirmed that a geology survey was conducted that autumn, but declined to release any associated documentation, citing administrative confidentiality. Dr. Ortega published his erosion study in 1979. It made no mention of the radio signal or the equipment confiscation. When contacted by researchers in the 1990s, he said only that he had been advised not to discuss certain aspects of the project and that he intended to honor that advice. David Runninghorse left academia in 1981. He returned to the Navajo Nation and worked as a translator for the tribal government until his retirement in 2012. He rarely spoke about the incident in his later years, though he reportedly told family members that he still remembered the voice, the calm, measured cadence, the numbers that seemed to mean something he could never decipher. Radio enthusiasts and researchers have attempted to identify the source of the transmission. No numbers station operating in 1977 matched the frequency or format described by Runninghorse. The Navajo language was not known to be used by any intelligence agency for coded broadcasts. The signal, by all available evidence, should not have existed. Massacre Cave remains restricted. The Navajo Nation does not permit research at the site without extensive cultural consultation, and such permission is rarely granted. The cave itself, the alcove where more than 100 people died in 1805, sits silent and unreachable, 600 feet above a canyon floor where radio signals do not behave as they should. The numbers were never decoded. The recording was never returned. The agents who took it left no names, no documentation, no explanation. David Runninghorse, in his final interview on the subject, was asked if he had any theory about what he had heard that evening in October of 1977. "I don't have a theory," he said. "I have a memory, a voice speaking numbers in my language, coming from a place where no voice should be. Maybe it was a station we didn't know about. Maybe it was something else." He paused, looking out toward the canyon rim. "My grandmother used to say that the dead don't always stay quiet, that sometimes they find ways to reach us, through dreams, through signs, through sounds we can't explain. Maybe that's what I heard. Maybe someone was trying to send a message." He shook his head slowly. "If they were, I never figured out what it meant, and I've been listening for it ever since." The frequency remains silent. The numbers remain unknown. And somewhere in Massacre Cave, 600 feet above the canyon floor, the silence holds whatever secrets it has always held, waiting perhaps for someone who knows how to listen. The rings told a story that could not have happened here. The North Rim Drive winds along the edge of Canyon de Chelly for approximately 17 miles, offering a series of overlooks that peer down into the red sandstone labyrinth below. Pinon pines and Utah junipers dot the rimland, their roots gripping the thin soil that covers the mesa's ancient rock. These trees are survivors, adapted to drought, heat, and the punishing winds that sweep across the high desert. Some of them have stood for 300 years or more, their growth rings recording every wet season and dry spell, every hard winter and merciful spring. Dendrochronology, the science of dating trees by their rings, has been used in the American Southwest for more than a century. The region's dry climate preserves wood exceptionally well, and researchers have constructed continuous tree ring records stretching back thousands of years. These records serve as a calendar of climate, allowing scientists to reconstruct rainfall patterns, temperature fluctuations, and drought cycles with remarkable precision. The trees of Canyon de Chelly have been studied extensively. Their rings align with regional climate data going back to the 1500s. They tell the same story as trees in Chaco Canyon, Mesa Verde, and the Chusca Mountains, a shared history written in wood. Which is why what Dr. Miriam Yazzie found in the summer of 2012 made no sense at all. Dr. Yazzie was an assistant professor of environmental science at Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado. Her research focused on climate reconstruction in the Four Corners region, and she had spent 3 summers collecting core samples from ancient trees throughout northeastern Arizona. Canyon de Chelly was one of several sites in her study area. On July 18, 2012, she was working along a section of the North Rim approximately 2 miles east of the Antelope House overlook. The area was unremarkable. Scattered pinyon pines, rocky soil, a view of the canyon that stretched for miles in either direction. She had collected samples from several dozen trees over the previous weeks, all of which showed the expected patterns. Then she cored a tree that changed everything. The pinon was medium-sized, perhaps 150 years old, based on its trunk diameter. Yazzie extracted a pencil-thin core sample using a standard increment borer and examined it in the field. The rings were clear and well-defined, but something was wrong. The pattern didn't match, she wrote in her field notes. I've looked at thousands of samples from this region. I know what the rings should look like. This tree showed a drought signature in 1896, but 1896 was a wet year in the Four Corners. It showed heavy growth in 1954, but 1954 was one of the worst droughts on record. She cored a second tree nearby. The same anomaly appeared. Then a third, a fourth, a fifth. A cluster of 7 trees in a roughly circular area, perhaps 40 meters across. All 7 showed the same inverted pattern. Wet years appeared as narrow rings. Drought years appeared as wide ones. The trees had recorded a climate history that was not just different from the surrounding region, it was precisely opposite. Yazzie brought her samples back to Fort Lewis College and ran them through standard analysis protocols. The results confirmed what she had seen in the field. The 7 trees showed no statistical correlation with regional climate records. Their growth patterns did not match Canyon de Chelly, the Chusca Mountains, Mesa Verde, or any other site in her database. She sent duplicate samples to the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research at the University of Arizona, the world's preeminent facility for dendrochronology. The results came back 6 weeks later, marked inconclusive. We were unable to cross-date the submitted samples with any existing regional chronology, the report stated. The ring width patterns do not correspond to known climate signals in the Four Corners region or adjacent areas. Further analysis is not possible without additional context. Yazzie contacted Dr. Thomas Harrigan, a senior researcher at the Arizona lab, seeking clarification. His response was cautious. "I've been doing this work for 30 years," Harrigan told her in a phone conversation that Yazzie later documented in her research notes. "I've seen anomalies before, trees affected by local groundwater, unusual soil conditions, insect damage, but those anomalies are random. They don't form coherent patterns. Your samples show a coherent pattern. It's just not one that makes any sense." When pressed for an explanation, Harrigan offered none. "If I had to guess, and I want to be clear that this is not a scientific statement, I would say these trees experienced a different climate history than the surrounding landscape, as if they grew somewhere else and were transplanted here, except they haven't been transplanted. The root structures are intact. They've been in that soil for over a century." A third laboratory at the University of Colorado analyzed the samples independently. Their report was even more puzzling. The wood itself was chemically consistent with pinon pine from the Canyon de Chelly area. The isotope ratios matched. The cellular structure was normal. But the growth patterns remained inexplicable. A technician at the Colorado lab, speaking off the record to a colleague of Yazzie's, put it more bluntly. It's as if these trees grew somewhere else entirely, somewhere with a completely different climate, and then they ended up here, still alive, still growing, but carrying a record of a place that doesn't exist. So, Yazzie attempted to expand her research. She proposed a formal study to the National Park Service and the Navajo Nation, requesting permission to conduct additional sampling in the area, install monitoring equipment, and investigate soil and groundwater conditions that might explain the anomaly. Both requests were denied. The Park Service cited resource management priorities and noted that the proposed research area fell within a zone designated for minimal intervention. The Navajo Nation Historic Preservation Department responded more briefly, stating that the location was culturally sensitive and that no research permits would be issued for the foreseeable future. Yazzie appealed both decisions. She provided additional documentation, offered to work with Navajo collaborators, and proposed limiting her study to non-invasive methods. The appeals were denied without further explanation. In the meantime, she attempted to gather information through other channels. She contacted local Navajo residents who lived near the canyon rim, hoping someone might have knowledge of the area's history or unusual characteristics. Most had little to offer, but an elderly woman named Pauline Begay, who had grown up in a hogan less than a mile from the site, recalled something her grandfather had told her decades earlier. He said there was a place on the rim where the trees didn't belong, Begay said in a 2014 interview. He called it the borrowed grove. He said the trees came from somewhere far away, not in distance, but in time. He never explained what that meant. He said it wasn't something that could be explained. When asked if she had ever visited the grove herself, Begay shook her head. My grandfather told me not to. He said the trees were still waiting to go back, that if you spent too much time near them, you might go back with them. She did not elaborate on what going back meant. Dr. Yazzie published a brief paper in 2015 describing the anomalous tree ring patterns she had documented. The paper was technical, cautious, and limited in its conclusions. It acknowledged the mystery without attempting to solve it. The scientific community largely ignored the findings. Without additional data that Yazzie was unable to collect due to permit restrictions, the anomaly remained an outlier, a curiosity without context. Yazzie left academia in 2017 to work for a private environmental consulting firm. She has not returned to Canyon de Chelly. The 7 trees still stand on the north rim, approximately 2 miles east of Antelope House Overlook. They look like any other pinyon pines, twisted trunks, dark green needles, the patient endurance of desert life. Visitors pass them without a second glance, but inside each one, recorded in rings of wood that will outlast any living memory, is a history that does not match this place. Wet years that should have been dry, droughts that should have been floods, a climate that never existed here, or perhaps existed somewhere else. Somewhere the trees remember, somewhere they may still be waiting to return. The camera captured something the eye refused to see. First Ruin is among the oldest documented archaeological sites in Canyon de Chelly, its crumbling stone walls tucked into an alcove along the canyon's southern branch. The structure dates to approximately 800 CE, making it one of the earliest permanent dwellings built by the ancestral Puebloans in the region. Spanish explorers noted its existence in the 1700s. American surveyors mapped it in the 1880s. By the mid-20th century, it had become a standard stop for visitors exploring the canyon by jeep or on foot. The site sits approximately 300 feet above the canyon floor, accessible only by guided tour or special permit. The alcove faces north, which means the ruin spends most of the day in shadow, emerging into direct sunlight only during the late afternoon hours when the angle of the sun reaches deep enough to illuminate the ancient walls. Photographers prize this window. The warm light brings out the red and gold tones of the sandstone, casting long shadows that emphasize the texture of the stone. Canyon de Chelly has been inhabited for nearly 5,000 years. The Navajo who live here today consider the land sacred, and the canyon holds layers of history that stretch far beyond written record. Some places accumulate memory differently than others. First Ruin is one of them, a site where the past feels closer to the surface, where the boundary between what was and what is seems thinner than it should be. It was here, on an August afternoon in 1965, that a family from Oklahoma posed for a photograph that would haunt them for decades. The Whitfield family arrived at Canyon de Chelly on August 14, 1965, during a 2-week road trip through the American Southwest. Robert Whitfield, a high school history teacher, had planned the trip as an educational experience for his 3 children: Daniel, age 14, Susan, age 11, and the youngest, Carol, who had just turned 7. His wife, Evelyn, documented the journey with a Kodak Brownie camera she had owned since their wedding. The family hired a Navajo guide to take them into the canyon on the morning of August 15th. They visited several sites over the course of the day, including White House Ruin, Antelope House, and First Ruin. At each location, Evelyn took photographs, the children standing before ancient walls, Robert pointing at petroglyphs, the guide waiting patiently beside his jeep. The photograph at First Ruin was taken at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon. The family posed in front of the alcove, their backs to the canyon wall, facing the camera. Evelyn set the Brownie on a flat rock, used the self-timer function, and hurried to join them before the shutter clicked. The resulting image shows all 5 family members standing in a loose row, squinting slightly against the late afternoon sun. Behind them, the ruins of First Ruin rise in soft focus. The canyon wall glows amber in the slanted light, and on that wall, cast in sharp relief, is a shadow that should not exist. It stands to the right of the family group, approximately 2 feet behind where Carol is positioned. The silhouette is tall and narrow, taller than any of the Whitfields, with proportions that suggest an adult male of unusual height. The shadow's head appears slightly elongated, and its arms hang straight at its sides. There is no corresponding figure in the photograph. No one was standing where the shadow indicates a person should be. The Whitfields did not notice the anomaly until several weeks after returning home to Tulsa. Evelyn had the film developed at a local drugstore and sorted the prints into an album. It was Daniel, the eldest son, who first pointed out the shadow while flipping through the photographs one evening. "I thought it was a trick of the light," Evelyn said in a 1987 interview with a regional newspaper. "Maybe a rock formation or the shape of the alcove. But the more I looked at it, the less sense it made. The shadow was too defined, too human." Robert examined the photograph with a magnifying glass. The shadow had clear edges, sharper than the family's own shadows, which were softer and more diffuse due to their distance from the wall. The mystery figure's shadow appeared to be cast from a point much closer to the stone. But what disturbed the family most was Carol's reaction. When shown the photograph, the 7-year-old studied it for a moment and then said, matter-of-factly, "That's the man who was standing behind us." Carol had mentioned the man before, during the drive back from Canyon de Chelly, and again at dinner that night. She said he had been standing near her while they posed for the picture. She said he was tall and thin and that he didn't move or speak. Her parents had assumed she was imagining things, perhaps spooked by the ancient ruins or the unfamiliar landscape. Now they were not so sure. "She never changed her story," Evelyn said. "Even as an adult, she insisted she saw someone standing there. She said he was watching us. She said he felt old, not elderly, but old in a different way, like he had been there for a very long time." Carol Whitfield, contacted for an interview in 2002, confirmed her mother's account but declined to elaborate. "I know what I saw," she said. "I've spent 40 years trying to convince myself I imagined it, but I didn't. He was there." The photograph was examined by several experts over the following decades. In 1973, Robert Whitfield submitted it to a photography professor at the University of Oklahoma, hoping for a technical explanation. The professor's analysis was thorough. He ruled out double exposure. The brownie's mechanism made such errors extremely rare, and there was no corresponding ghosting elsewhere in the image. He ruled out darkroom manipulation. The negative was intact and showed no signs of tampering. He examined the shadow's angle relative to the sun's position and concluded that it was geometrically consistent with a figure standing approximately 18 inches behind and to the right of Carol Whitfield. "The shadow is real," the professor wrote in his report. "It was cast by something present at the moment the photograph was taken. What that something was, I cannot determine." In 1991, a forensic imaging specialist reviewed the photograph using early digital enhancement techniques. Her findings were similar. The shadow showed none of the artifacts associated with manipulation or optical illusion. Its edges, density, and angle were consistent with a three-dimensional object interrupting the late afternoon sunlight. "If this is a hoax, it's an extraordinarily sophisticated one," she wrote. "The family would have needed access to equipment and expertise that simply didn't exist for amateur photographers in 1965. The Whitfields never claimed the photograph proved anything supernatural. They simply asked for an explanation. None was ever provided. A retired Park Service ranger named Wilson Sosi, who worked at Canyon de Chelly from 1958 to 1984, recalled hearing about the photograph in the early 1970s. "Someone brought it to the visitor center," he said in a 2009 interview. "They wanted to know if we'd ever seen anything like it. I looked at the shadow and I felt, I don't know how to describe it, cold, like I was looking at something I wasn't supposed to see." When asked if he had an explanation, Sosi shook his head. "The old people say there are watchers in the canyon, beings who were here before the Dene, before the Anasazi, before anyone. They don't interfere. They just watch. Maybe one of them wanted to be remembered." He paused before adding, "Or maybe it's just a shadow. But I've lived in that canyon my whole life, and shadows don't usually stand behind you when there's nothing there to cast them." The Whitfield family photograph remains in private hands, held by Carol Whitfield, the youngest child in the image. She has declined multiple requests to have it re-examined using modern digital analysis techniques. "I don't need anyone else to tell me what's in that picture," she said. "I already know. I've always known." Robert and Evelyn Whitfield passed away in 2001 and 2007, respectively. Daniel died in 2015. Susan still lives in Oklahoma but does not discuss the photograph. First Ruin remains accessible to visitors who arrange guided tours through the canyon. Thousands of people have stood in the same spot where the Whitfields posed more than 50 years ago, their backs to the ancient wall, their faces toward the camera. Most of their photographs show nothing unusual, but some visitors report a strange feeling at the site, a sense of being observed, of standing too close to something unseen. A few have mentioned the sensation of someone just behind them, just out of frame, waiting to be noticed. The canyon keeps its own records. Some are written in stone, others are written in light and shadow, captured in a fraction of a second, preserved on film that never lies. The shadow in the Whitfield photograph has never been explained. It stands where no one stood, cast by a figure that no one saw, except perhaps for a 7-year-old girl who knew even then that some things are real whether we believe them or not. North is not where it should be. Standing Cow Ruin takes its name from a Navajo pictograph painted on the canyon wall nearby. A spotted cow, rendered in white and brown pigment, standing in profile against the red sandstone. The image dates to the mid-19th century, likely depicting livestock brought by Spanish or American settlers. But the ruin itself is far older. The stone structures tucked into the alcove above the pictograph were built by ancestral Puebloans, sometime between 1100 and 1300 CE, part of the vast network of cliff dwellings that once housed thousands of people throughout Canyon de Chelly. The site sits in the main canyon, approximately 8 miles from the visitor center at Chelly. Access requires a guided tour or special permit. The terrain is difficult, the cultural significance profound. Few visitors make the journey. Those who do often remark on the stillness of the place, the way sound seems to die before it reaches the walls, the strange quality of the light in the alcove's shadow. Canyon de Chelly has been studied by archaeologists, geologists, and anthropologists for more than a century. Its formations are well documented, its history carefully recorded. The sandstone walls are composed of de Chelly sandstone, a geological formation dating to the Permian period, approximately 270 million years ago. There are no known magnetic anomalies in the region, no iron deposits or volcanic intrusions that might affect navigational instruments. And yet, compasses do not work properly at Standing Cow Ruin. They have not worked properly there for as long as anyone can remember. The first documented report of the anomaly came in 1947, when a surveying team from the Bureau of Indian Affairs was conducting boundary assessments throughout the Navajo Nation. The team leader, a civil engineer named George McCready, noted in his field log that compass readings near Standing Cow Ruin were unreliable and inconsistent. Approached the site from the southeast at approximately 0930 hours, McCready wrote. Standard compass began showing erratic behavior at roughly 200 feet from the ruin. Needle oscillated between north and east for several seconds before settling at a bearing approximately 20 degrees east of expected north. Repeated measurements produced similar results. No explanation apparent. McCready's log was filed with the Bureau's regional office in Gallup and forgotten for decades. It was rediscovered in 1979 by a graduate student researching historical survey methods in the Southwest. By then, the anomaly had been independently observed dozens of times. Hikers, guides, archaeologists, and Park Service personnel had all reported similar experiences. Compasses that spun without settling, needles that pointed somewhere other than north, navigational equipment that behaved as if responding to an invisible force. The deviation was remarkably consistent, approximately 23 degrees east of magnetic north, give or take 2 degrees depending on the observer and the instrument. The boundary of the effect was equally consistent. It began at roughly 200 feet from the ruin and intensified as one approached the alcove. Beyond 200 feet, compasses functioned normally. Inside the boundary, they did not. Raymond Toledo, a Navajo guide who led tours into Canyon de Chelly from 1968 to 1994, encountered the anomaly hundreds of times during his career. "I stopped carrying a compass after my first year," he said in a 2001 interview. "There was no point. It didn't work near Standing Cow. None of them did. I'd watch tourists pull out their fancy equipment, expensive compasses, the kind hikers pay good money for, and they'd all do the same thing. Spin, settle wrong, spin again." Toledo said he learned to navigate that section of the canyon by landmarks and memory, the way his grandfather had taught him. "The old people knew about that place he said. They didn't call it an anomaly. They called it a door. They said the directions were different there because it led somewhere else, somewhere the usual rules didn't apply." When asked if he believed the stories, Toledo considered the question carefully. "I believe something is there," he said. "Whether it's magnetic or spiritual or something else, I don't know. But the compasses don't lie. Something is pulling them in a direction that doesn't exist on any map. Dr. Evelyn Fairbanks, a geophysicist who visited the site in 1976 as part of an informal investigation, offered a more cautious assessment. "The deviation is real," she said in a 1993 interview. "I measured it myself with 3 different instruments, but the cause remains unexplained. The geology doesn't support a magnetic anomaly of that magnitude. There's no iron ore, no basalt intrusion, nothing that should create a localized field strong enough to affect a compass at that distance." She paused before adding, "I've spent my career studying magnetic phenomena. This is the only site I've ever encountered where the readings simply don't make sense. The numbers are internally consistent. The anomaly is reproducible, but they don't correspond to anything in the physical environment. It's as if the magnetic field at that location follows different rules." In 1982, the U.S. Geological Survey dispatched a team to Canyon de Chelly to investigate reports of unusual magnetic activity at several sites, including Standing Cow Ruin. The team spent 3 weeks in the canyon, collecting data with magnetometers, conducting soil analyses, and mapping the subsurface geology using ground-penetrating radar. Their findings were never published. An internal memo dated November of 1982, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request in 2004, summarized the team's conclusions in cautious language. The relevant passage reads, "Measurements at Site 7, Standing Cow Ruin, produced readings inconsistent with known geophysical models. Magnetic field strength and direction within the anomaly zone do not correlate with local geological features or regional magnetic surveys. Source of deviation remains undetermined. Further investigation recommended." No further investigation was conducted. The project file was closed in January of 1983. Budget documents from that period show that funding for the follow-up study was reallocated to higher priority geological assessments in other regions. The team leader, Dr. Philip Anaya, retired from the USGS in 1989. He declined interview requests for years, but reportedly told a colleague that the Standing Cow data was the strangest thing he'd encountered in 30 years of fieldwork. He said the instruments weren't malfunctioning, the colleague recalled. They were working perfectly. They were just measuring something that shouldn't have been there. Attempts to access the original data files from the 1982 survey have been unsuccessful. The USGS Records Office states that the files were transferred to archival storage in 1991. Requests to retrieve them have been met with delays, lost paperwork, and eventual silence. The Park Service maintains no official position on the compass anomaly. Visitor materials for Canyon de Chelly make no mention of it. Rangers, when asked, typically attribute the reports to user error, faulty equipment, or the natural variability of magnetic fields in canyon environments. But the anomaly persists, and the deviation remains precisely 23 degrees. Standing Cow Ruin still stands in its alcove, 8 miles into a canyon that has held human presence for 5,000 years. The spotted cow pictograph still watches from the wall below, faded but visible, a remnant of a more recent past. Visitors who make the journey sometimes bring compasses, curious to test the stories they have heard. Most report the same experience. The needle spins, hesitates, and settles somewhere it should not be, 23 degrees east of north, every time. No geological explanation has ever been confirmed. No official study has ever been completed. The anomaly exists in a space between what can be measured and what can be understood, documented enough to be real, unexplained enough to remain unsettling. Raymond Toledo, before his death in 2009, was asked one final time what he thought caused the compass anomaly at Standing Cow Ruin. "I think there's something under that place," he said, "or inside it, something that doesn't belong to the world we know. The compasses aren't broken. They're pointing at something real. We just can't see what it is." He looked toward the canyon as he spoke, his expression unreadable. Maybe that's for the best. Maybe some directions aren't meant to be followed. The needle still spins. The deviation holds steady, and somewhere beneath the ancient stone, something continues to pull, patient, invisible, and 23 degrees away from anywhere the maps say it should be. Someone walked through a room that had no door. Tunnel Canyon is a narrow tributary of Canyon de Chelly, cutting northeast into the mesa approximately 4 miles from the main canyon's mouth. The passage is tight in places, barely wide enough for a single person to walk, and opens into a series of small alcoves where ancestral Puebloans built modest cliff dwellings between 900 and 1300 CE. Unlike the grander ruins at White House or Mummy Cave, these structures were simple. A few rooms, perhaps housing a single family or serving as seasonal shelters for hunters and farmers working the canyon's upper reaches. The site designated as TC-17 sits in one of these alcoves, approximately 120 feet above the canyon floor. It consists of 3 visible rooms in varying states of collapse, their stone walls still bearing traces of the mud plaster that once sealed them against the elements. The alcove faces west, catching the afternoon sun, and offers a commanding view of the narrow canyon below. Canyon de Chelly was designated a national monument in 1931, but comprehensive archaeological surveys of its more remote sites did not begin until the 1960s and 70s. Tunnel Canyon, difficult to access and far from the main visitor routes, was among the last areas to be systematically documented. In the autumn of 1971, a team from the University of Arizona arrived to survey the canyon's smaller ruins, including TC-17. They expected routine work, measuring structures, documenting construction techniques, collecting surface artifacts for analysis. What they found in a sealed chamber at the back of the alcove was anything but routine. The survey team consisted of 4 researchers: Dr. Howard Nakamura, a specialist in southwestern archaeology, 2 graduate students, Ellen Bryce and Martin Salazar, and a Navajo consultant named Thomas Benally, who served as guide and cultural liaison. They reached TC-17 on the morning of October 14th after a difficult climb from the canyon floor. The visible rooms were unremarkable. Typical ancestral Puebloan construction, abandoned centuries ago. But Benally noticed something the others had missed: a section of the back wall that appeared slightly different in color and texture, as if it had been plastered over more recently than the surrounding stone. Closer examination revealed that the plaster concealed a small opening, approximately 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, that had been deliberately sealed. The mortar was old, perhaps as old as the original construction, but it had clearly been applied after the room was built. Dr. Nakamura made the decision to carefully remove a section of the plaster and examine what lay behind. The work took several hours. When the opening was finally clear, the team shone flashlights into the darkness beyond. The chamber was small, roughly 8 feet by 10 feet, with a ceiling low enough that an adult would need to crouch. The floor was covered in a thick layer of fine dust, undisturbed and uniform. Except for the footprints. A single line of barefoot human prints crossed the chamber from the eastern wall to the western wall. The prints were clearly defined, pressed into dust that had accumulated over centuries. They showed the distinctive shape of human feet, heel, arch, toes, spaced at the interval of a normal walking gait. The prints began at the eastern wall. They ended at the western wall. Both walls were solid rock. There was no entrance except the sealed opening the team had just created. There was no exit. There was no explanation for how anyone could have walked into a room with no door, crossed it, and vanished into solid stone. Ellen Bryce was the first to enter the chamber, crawling through the narrow opening with a flashlight and camera. Her initial reaction, recorded in her field notes, was confusion. "The footprints are real," she wrote. "I can see the texture of the skin, the pressure points where the weight shifted. These were made by a living person, but there's nowhere for them to have come from, nowhere for them to have gone." She photographed the prints from multiple angles, then withdrew to allow the others to examine the chamber. Each reached the same conclusion. The prints were genuine, they were old, and they could not be explained by any normal means. Thomas Benally refused to enter the chamber. He stood at the opening, looked inside briefly, and then stepped back without speaking. When Bryce asked him what he thought, he shook his head. "This is not for us," he said. "This place was sealed for a reason." Later, in a 1998 interview with a researcher studying Navajo oral traditions, Benally offered a more detailed account. "My grandmother told me about places like that," he said. "She called them walking rooms. She said some of the old ones knew how to travel in ways we don't understand anymore. They could walk through stone the way we walk through air, but those paths were dangerous. Once you started walking, you might not be able to stop. You might end up somewhere you couldn't come back from." He paused before adding, "The footprints we found, they went into the wall, not out of it. Whoever made them was trying to leave. I don't think they made it." Dr. Nakamura, in contrast, sought a scientific explanation. He noted in his field report that the chamber showed no signs of disturbance prior to their entry. No animal tracks, no collapsed sections, no evidence of water infiltration that might have created the prints through some natural process. "The prints are anomalous," he wrote. "They appear to be human in origin, but the circumstances of their creation remain undetermined. Further investigation is warranted." The team spent approximately 4 hours at TC-17 on October 14th. They documented the chamber as thoroughly as conditions allowed, collected dust samples for laboratory analysis, and made detailed sketches of the footprint pattern. Then something unusual happened. The following morning, Dr. Nakamura received a radio message from the Park Service Regional Office in Window Rock. The survey of TC-17 was to be suspended immediately. The team was instructed to reseal the chamber using materials that would be delivered to their base camp that afternoon. No explanation was provided. No questions were answered. The resealing was completed on October 16th, 48 hours after the chamber was first opened. The plaster used was formulated to match the original material as closely as possible. When the work was done, the chamber looked exactly as it had before the team arrived. Dr. Nakamura filed his field report with the university and the Park Service. The report included detailed descriptions of the footprints, measurements of the chamber, and references to the photographs Bryce had taken. Within 6 months, the photographs had disappeared from the university's archives. The field report was reclassified as restricted with no explanation. Requests to access the material were denied. Bryce, who left archaeology in 1974 to pursue a career in education, kept copies of her personal field notes. She shared them with researchers in 2003, providing the most detailed surviving account of what the team found. "I know what I saw," she said in that interview. "I've spent 30 years trying to make sense of it. The prints were real. They crossed that room, and they stopped at a wall with no opening, no crack, no passage, nothing." She hesitated before continuing. "Sometimes I think about whoever made those prints. Walking into a room they couldn't get out of, crossing to the other side and finding only stone. What did they do then? Where did they go?" She never returned to Canyon de Chelly. TC-17 remains sealed. The Park Service does not include it in any public documentation of Canyon de Chelly's archaeological sites. The location is not marked on visitor maps, and access to Tunnel Canyon requires special permits that are rarely granted. The footprints, presumably, are still there, pressed into dust that has now gone undisturbed for more than 50 years. A single line of human steps crossing a room that has no entrance and no exit, beginning at stone and ending at stone. Thomas Benally, before his death in 2011, was asked one final time what he believed about the sealed chamber. "I believe the prints are a warning," he said. "Someone walked a path they shouldn't have walked. They found a door that wasn't meant to be opened, and they went through." He looked toward the distant rim of the canyon, his expression unreadable. The question isn't where they came from. The question is where they went, and whether they're still trying to get back. The chamber remains sealed. The prints remain unexplained. And somewhere in the darkness behind the plaster wall, the dust holds the shape of feet that walked a journey no one has ever been able to follow. They left everything behind except themselves. Black Rock Canyon branches off the main channel of Canyon de Chelly, approximately 12 miles from the visitor center at Chelly, cutting northeast into terrain that grows increasingly difficult with every mile. The canyon takes its name from a distinctive basalt formation near its mouth, a dark intrusion in the otherwise uniform red sandstone deposited by volcanic activity millions of years before the first humans set foot in the region. Beyond this landmark, the canyon narrows and deepens, its walls rising to heights of 800 feet or more before eventually pinching out in a series of dead-end alcoves that have never been fully mapped. The Navajo have lived in and around Canyon de Chelly for centuries, but Black Rock Canyon has always been treated differently. Families who farm the main canyon floor rarely venture into its depths. Livestock that wander in sometimes fail to return. The old stories speak of the place with caution, describing it as a location where the wind speaks wrong, and where travelers should not linger after dark. In 1923, Canyon de Chelly had not yet been designated a national monument. Access was largely unregulated, and amateur expeditions, driven by the era's fascination with southwestern archaeology, were common. Some were conducted responsibly. Others were little more than treasure hunts, their participants hoping to find artifacts that could be sold to collectors or museums back east. The Whitfield party fell somewhere in between. Howard Whitfield was a 42-year-old insurance executive from Denver with a passionate interest in ancient cultures. He had organized 2 previous expeditions to the Four Corners region, both of which produced modest findings and no serious incidents. In August of 1923, he assembled a team of 4 companions for what he described in letters as a thorough survey of the canyon's more remote tributaries. The party consisted of Whitfield, his brother-in-law, Dr. James Ogilvy, a physician from Santa Fe, a photographer named Charles Reinhardt, a young graduate student from Yale named Arthur Mercer, and a local guide, a Navajo man identified in records only as Tom. They departed Chelly on August 17th, traveling by horseback with supplies for 2 weeks. According to a letter Whitfield posted before leaving, their primary destination was Black Rock Canyon, which he believed that contained undocumented cliff dwellings that previous surveyors had overlooked. The group was expected to return by September 1st. When they failed to appear, a search was organized. On September 4th, a party of 8 men, including 2 local ranchers and a deputy from the Apache County Sheriff's Office, located the Whitfield camp approximately 4 miles into Black Rock Canyon. The site was positioned in a small alcove at the base of the eastern wall, sheltered from wind and visible only from directly below. The camp was completely intact. Tents stood upright, their canvas undamaged. Cooking equipment sat beside a fire pit that still contained the remains of a meal, beans and dried beef, half-eaten, still in the pot. Bedrolls were arranged as if the occupants had simply risen for the day and never returned. Personal effects, watches, wallets, a Bible belonging to Dr. Ogilvy, remained in place. The horses were gone, though their hobbles were found nearby, unfastened and discarded. And surrounding the camp, drawn in the sandy floor of the alcove, was a series of circular patterns that none of the searchers could identify. Tanuk. The patterns were documented by the search party's leader, a rancher named Hosteen Begay, who later provided detailed descriptions to investigators. There were 7 circles in total, each approximately 4 feet in diameter, arranged in an irregular ring around the camp's perimeter. Inside each circle were smaller concentric rings, numbering between 3 and 5, with a small dot or depression at the center. They looked deliberate, Begay said in a deposition taken 2 weeks after the search. Not like something animals would make, not like anything I'd ever seen in the canyon. I asked the other Navajo men if they recognized the design. None of them did. Begay noted that the patterns appeared to have been drawn with care, using a stick or finger to trace lines in the sand. There was no indication of who had made them or when. The strange thing, he added, was that the footprints inside the camp were normal. Boot prints, moccasin prints, the marks you'd expect from 5 men living there for a few days. But outside the circles, there were no footprints at all, not from the men, not from the horses, nothing leading away. A second searcher, a deputy named Walter Hensley, corroborated this account. It was like they'd just vanished from inside those circles, Hensley said. The tracks stopped at the edge. There was nothing beyond. No sign anyone had walked out of that camp in any direction. Hensley also reported an unusual sensation while at the site, a feeling of being watched that he could not attribute to any visible source. I've been in a lot of wild places, he said. I know what it feels like when animals are nearby, when someone's looking at you from a distance. This was different. It felt like the canyon itself was paying attention. The official investigation into the Whitfield disappearance lasted approximately 6 weeks. The Apache County Sheriff's Office led the effort, coordinating with the Bureau of Indian Affairs and conducting interviews with anyone who had contact with the party before their departure. The findings were inconclusive. No bodies were ever recovered. No trace of the 5 men was found beyond the camp itself. The horses were never located despite extensive searches of the surrounding area. The journals left behind, including a detailed diary kept by Arthur Mercer, ended mid-sentence on August 22nd, 5 days into the expedition. Mercer's final entry read, "Reinhardt believes he saw something moving on the rim this afternoon. We investigated, but found nothing. Tom has become reluctant to continue. He says the canyon is wrong past the Black Rock. Whitfield insists we press on tomorrow. I confess I share Tom's." The sentence was never finished. The pen was found beside the journal, its cap removed, as if the writer had been interrupted and never returned. The circular patterns were photographed by a member of the search party, but the images were later reported lost. Hand-drawn reproductions, based on Begay's descriptions, were included in the case file, but have never been matched to any known cultural tradition, ancestral Puebloan, Navajo, or otherwise. In November of 1923, the investigation was suspended. The case was officially classified as missing persons, presumed deceased, though no cause of death was ever established. The file was transferred to the Bureau of Indian Affairs archive in Albuquerque, where it remained untouched for decades. A researcher who examined the file in 1978 noted that several pages appeared to be missing, including the original incident report and all photographs taken at the scene. A handwritten note in the margin of the inventory sheet read, "Materials removed per directive. See file 1924-117. File 1924-117 has never been located." Tepotab. Black Rock Canyon remains difficult to access. The Park Service does not include it in guided tours, and permits for independent exploration are rarely granted. The terrain is cited as the primary concern. The narrow passages and unstable walls make the area hazardous for inexperienced hikers, but some researchers have noted that the canyon's exclusion from official documentation seems disproportionate to its actual dangers. Other, more treacherous areas of Canyon de Chelly are accessible with proper permits. Black Rock Canyon is simply avoided, as if by unspoken agreement. The Whitfield camp was never excavated. The alcove, where 5 men made their last known camp, remains undisturbed, its contents long since reclaimed by weather, time, and the slow processes of decay. But the circles were reportedly still visible as late as 1951, when a geological survey team briefly entered the canyon and noted unexplained ground markings in their field log. They did not investigate further. No one knows who drew the patterns or why. No one knows what Howard Whitfield and his companions saw on the rim that August afternoon, or what made their guide so reluctant to continue. No one knows where they went when they walked beyond the circles, if they walked at all. The canyon offers no answers. It never has. Only the silence remains, and the faint impression in the sand of shapes that no one can explain, waiting, perhaps, for someone else to step inside. The canyon speaks back, but it does not repeat what you say. Face Rock Overlook sits along the South Rim Drive of Canyon de Chelly National Monument, approximately 7 miles from the Visitor Center at Chelly. The viewpoint takes its name from a natural formation in the opposing cliff face, a profile of eroded sandstone that from certain angles resembles a human face gazing westward across the valley. The Navajo have their own name for the formation, though it is not commonly shared with outsiders. The overlook itself offers one of the deepest views into the canyon system, with walls dropping more than 700 feet to the sandy wash below. Echoes are a defining feature of Canyon de Chelly. The sandstone walls are hard and smooth in places, creating acoustic conditions that reflect sound with unusual clarity. Visitors often shout into the canyon simply to hear their voices return, a harmless amusement repeated thousands of times each year. The echoes behave predictably. A word shouted from the rim returns 1 to 3 seconds later, depending on the width of the canyon at that point. The sound may repeat multiple times, growing fainter with each reflection. The physics are well understood. The phenomenon is ordinary, except at Face Rock Overlook, where something different sometimes happens. The first written account dates to 1961. The most recent was recorded in 2019. In between, dozens of visitors have reported the same impossible experience. They shouted a word into the canyon, and the echo that returned was not the word they spoke. It was a different word entirely. Margaret Holbrook was a retired school teacher from Phoenix who visited Canyon de Chelly with her husband in October of 1984. They stopped at Face Rock Overlook in the late afternoon, when the canyon was empty of other tourists and the light was beginning to soften toward evening. "I shouted, 'Hello,' into the canyon," Holbrook wrote in a letter to the Park Service 3 weeks later. "My husband was standing beside me. We both heard the echo, but it didn't say hello. It said, 'Come,' clear as day, not distorted, not muffled, just a different word." She waited a moment, then shouted again. "Who's there?" The echo returned. "Waiting." Holbrook's husband corroborated the account in a separate letter, noting that he had initially assumed his wife was playing a joke on him. But when he shouted his own word, "Test," the echo returned something that sounded like "yes." "We left immediately," Margaret wrote. "I don't know what was in that canyon, and I don't want to know. But something was listening, something that understood what we were saying." The Park Service filed the letters without response. They were not the first such reports, and they would not be the last. In 1992, a geology professor from Northern Arizona University named Dr. Stephen Yazzie experienced the phenomenon while conducting fieldwork near Face Rock. He had shouted to a colleague positioned further along the rim, calling out "ready" to signal that he was prepared to begin measurements. The echo came back. Always. Yazzie, a Navajo who had grown up near the canyon, recognized the strangeness immediately. He did not shout again. "I asked my grandmother about it later," he said in a 2010 interview. She wasn't surprised. She said the canyon has voices that aren't ours. She said sometimes they answer because they want you to come closer. She told me never to answer back. Dr. Patricia Fuentes was a linguistics professor at the University of New Mexico, specializing in acoustic phenomena and auditory perception. In 2007, she received a small grant to study reports of anomalous echoes at Canyon de Chelly, including the accounts from Face Rock Overlook. Her methodology was straightforward. Over a 2-month period in the spring and summer of that year, she and 2 graduate assistants visited Face Rock at various times of day, shouting predetermined words into the canyon and recording the results with high-fidelity audio equipment. The majority of their recordings showed normal echo behavior, but on 14 occasions, spread across 9 separate visits, the recorded echo did not match the original word. The alterations were subtle but unmistakable. When Fuentes shouted "water," the echo returned deeper. When she shouted "hello," it returned below. When her assistant shouted "anyone," the echo came back "always." Spectrographic analysis of the recordings ruled out simple distortion. The returned words were not garbled versions of the originals. They were phonetically distinct, with different vowel patterns and consonant structures. They were, by every measurable standard, different words. More troubling was the pattern Fuentes began to notice. The returned words were not random. They appeared to be responses, contextually appropriate replies to the words being shouted. "It was as if something was listening," she wrote in her unpublished research notes, "and answering." Fuentes applied for additional funding to expand her study. The application was denied without explanation. When she attempted to publish her preliminary findings in an academic journal, the paper was rejected by 3 separate reviewers, each citing insufficient evidence and methodological concerns that Fuentes believed were unfounded. She abandoned the research in 2008. The Park Service has never issued an official statement regarding the echo anomaly at Face Rock Overlook. Internal correspondence obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request in 2014 shows that reports of unusual acoustic phenomena at the site have been logged since at least 1958, but no formal investigation has ever been conducted. A memo from 1971, authored by a regional supervisor whose name has been redacted, recommends that staff avoid discussing acoustic anomalies with visitors and that reports of unusual echoes be filed without follow-up. The rationale given is prevention of unnecessary concern and potential liability. Acoustics experts consulted for this account offered various theories to explain the phenomenon. Some suggested that unusual rock formations might create interference patterns that alter sound in unpredictable ways. Others proposed that visitors were mishearing their own echoes, that the brain, expecting a certain word, might interpret ambiguous sounds as something different. But none of these explanations accounted for the recordings Fuentes made, recordings that showed clear, unambiguous words returning from the canyon, words that were not the ones being spoken. Dr. Fuentes, contacted in 2018 for a retrospective interview, declined to discuss her research in detail. "I documented what I heard," she said. "The recordings speak for themselves, but some questions shouldn't be answered, and some answers shouldn't be repeated." When asked what she meant, she paused for a long moment. "The last word I shouted into that canyon was, 'Goodbye,'" she said. "The echo came back soon. I haven't been back since, and I don't intend to go yet." Face Rock. Overlook remains one of the most popular stops along the South Rim Drive. Thousands of visitors stand at its edge each year, gazing down into the canyon, raising their voices to hear them return. Most hear exactly what they expect, their own words reflected and fading. But a few hear something else, a word that doesn't match, a voice that seems to come from deeper than the walls should allow, an answer to a question they didn't know they were asking. The canyon has been occupied for 5,000 years. The ancestral Puebloans lived and died here. The Navajo have called it home for centuries. And before all of them, before any written record, before any human memory, something else may have listened from the depths, waiting for voices to echo down from the rim, waiting to answer. The words come back wrong, not always, not for everyone, but often enough that the pattern cannot be dismissed, often enough that the Park Service has quietly instructed its staff to say nothing. Shout into the canyon at Face Rock Overlook, and your voice will return to you. But listen carefully, because sometimes the echo knows what you said, and sometimes it has something else to say.